Gabriel Roy Bibliography. Born March 22nd, 1909, in St. Boniface, Manitoba, she was the youngest of 11 children. Only 8 of them survived childbirth. Her parents, Leon and Melina Roy, were the descendants of Quebecan pioneers. Gabrielle really cherished her mother, and because of this, we see a lot of strong mother figures in her novels. Her family was relatively poor, and stories of hope were common. This is also something we see in her novels. Her father worked towards settling immigrants in Western Canada, and this exposure to diversity is something also reflected in the novels. Her father died in 1929, but as she said, she was never really close to him. Her father worked towards settling immigrants in Western Canada, and this exposure to diversity is something also reflected in the novels. She then left for England and France to pursue interests in literature and theatre, but her efforts were fruitless. Then she moved to Montreal, where she discovered the poverty of St. Henry district. This inspired her to write a novel. In 1945, she published her first novel, Bombard the Occasion. It was a huge success. In it, she portrays the reality of living in poverty of St. Henry district. This novel was translated and called The Tin Flute, as it was originally written in French. The Tin Flute Summary. This novel portrays the lives of many characters living in the 1940s Montreal. Young Florentine Lacasse, a waitress who lives in the slums of St. Henry district. She lives with her family of 11 and her mother who is pregnant with the 12th. Florentine is desperate to get out of poverty. She meets a young man, Jean Reski, who is an egomaniac, thinking he's above others. Florentine's father, a carpenter, cannot hold a job because he's a dreamer. Her mother, Roseanne, is constantly worried about the family's meager funds. Later, Eugene, Florentine's brother, tells his mother that he enlisted in the army to be able to financially help his family by sending $12 a month of his wage. Florentine then meets Emmanuel, who is also enlisted. He immediately falls in love with her, but she does not share his affection, as she only loves Jean. Later, Florentine gets pregnant with Jean's child. Jean is repulsed by this and Florentine's poverty, and runs away from her. He moves to a distant arms factory to get a job there. Florentine then accepts Emmanuel's marriage proposal and tries to convince herself that the child is Emmanuel's. At the end of the novel, we hear of the fall of France in 1940, and how the French Canadians are saddened for a homeland they never saw. Treatment of Canada in the novel. In the novel The Tin Flute, we see a very interesting treatment of Canada, as it is written by a French Canadian, and as such, we see the story through the eyes of French Canadians. This is very interesting because back then and even now, most novels written in Canada were written by Canadians of English descent, and as such, we see a really unique perspective in the novel. Unlike most novels written in the wartime, which really focused on patriotism and inspiring the people to fight for their homeland, England, where most Canadians of that time were from, in this novel we don't see that because it was written by a Canadian of French origin. Also in the novel, something we see different is that the author does not try to romanticize or cover up the problem that existed in many Canadian cities of that time, and it was poverty. In pretty much every major city in Canada, there was a district that was poverty stricken. And close to the end of the novel, we return to what I already discussed about the treatment of Canada and how when news broke of that France had fallen to Nazi Germany in 1940, Canadians living in Montreal who consider themselves to be French, not English, were really saddened for a homeland they never saw and never been to, but they felt this connection to it, this ancestral connection. These days in modern novels, we don't see this. We don't see authors trying to patriotize people and the story of being either from England or French, because right now we consider ourselves Canadian. We don't consider ourselves English or French. But at that time when Canada was just less than 100 years old, and before that it was a French colony, the people living in Canada at that time in the 1940s were only 2-3 generations away from Canada being an English colony and maybe 5 generations away from it being a French colony. And this idea of being not Canadian but French or English is really interesting because we don't see it these days now. And ultimately, this idea that back then people wouldn't consider themselves Canadian as much as they would consider themselves English or French or Irish or German or wherever they came from. And this was because mostly, again, the generational separation of people living in their homeland and then moving to Canada was only 1, 2 generations. While now we have this distinct identity of Canada being itself a country, it's independent country, and us being not descendants from other countries, but being Canadian.